Hi,
Hi,
how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good.
What's your name?
Yeah, fair enough. I'm Elias. I'm a writer. I live in Philly. Yeah, what's your name?
My name is Claire, and I'm in Paris right now. I'm in my living room, and it's very hot, so I'm really sweaty. Uh, and I'm a journalist and writer too. What else? And I write for I write as a journalist. I write on tech related issues. It's also sort of my day job. So some of it is not that interesting. And I write for radio, and I write books, more like radio play. And I write, what do I write about? Like more, let's say, I don't know. It depends. Like my last book was about porn, sort of auto genealogy of my relationship to porn, something like
Mm.
that. And I write also about collective, political collectives. And my previous book was about, I don't know, I don't know, maybe you've heard of them, a group of Puerto Rican who were active in New York from 69 to 76 called the Young Lords,
Oh yeah.
the Young Lords Party. So I wrote about them too. Ouais, voilà. And I'm also very pregnant. So that's my 8th month. So I'm
Well,
also really, yeah, I'm pretty like,
yeah, thanks for taking the time.
no, it's lovely. I love that. I mean, I'm on maternity leave. So pretty much it's supposed to be this really domestic time as like the end of your pregnancy. But because of the confinement, I've been sitting on this couch a lot for the past months.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I suppose I should say more about myself. I'm Elias. I live in Philly in the US. Um, yeah, my day job is, well, at any given time, I have multiple jobs. Right now, my day job is I'm a graduate student, and I'm working on a dissertation on representations of police violence. I'm also, working on a novel that is forthcoming, um, about a sort of, a young gay Floridian who's moved out of Florida, who had dated a girl when he was in high school, who's passed away, and then decides to come home and try and confront his relationship to her and to his history and to his family's history.
okay.
Um, I also, currently am a freelance writer like everybody else, I suppose. Yeah, I do a lot of book reviews, mostly about history. I try really hard not to review novels because there's usually too much to say. And historians, they just sort of lay it out for you chronologically. You kind of know how to review it because it's like, well, we'll just put things in order. So yeah, right now I have a piece forthcoming about a book about the Republic of New Afrika, which was a short-lived movement. There's a new book about it by Edward Onaci, and it was a sort of short-lived movement in which basically a group of like Black activists in the late 60s just declared independence from the US, a group of African Americans, and they tried to found a country from Louisiana to the Carolinas, and the US government didn't take too kindly to these efforts, and so it's sort of about their efforts to try to form a nation within the US of African Americans. And it's a great book.
And I have so many questions on many things that you've said previously, but just on that one, how did that how did they establish, let's say, like the territory or the boundaries of that nation?
Yeah, that's a good question. Some of this is sort of historical. In the 20s, there was this sort of sociological work that gave rise to like what was called like the Black Belt, or the notion of the South as the Black Belt, in which there are all these regions in the South that are like 80% or more Black and primarily composed of people who were descendants of enslaved people. And in 28, the Communist Party, or the Comintern, I should say, released this resolution for self-determination for the Black Belt. The notion was that, like, Black people in America should have their own country. They constitute something like an internal colony. And this idea sort of goes down across the generations. And that's part of how the boundaries get shaped. This sort of notion that, like, the South is the kind of the
Okay.
ancestral homeland for enslaved Black people. because it's just majority Black, or in that particular region.
Okay.
Yeah. Can I ask about your Young Lords book?
Sure.
Yeah, can you tell me just a little bit more about, why you chose to write about the Young Lords or what the book's about?
I think initially it's just because, I mean, I was in New York I lived in New York for a few years, and I was doing this residency in Brooklyn called Union Docs. It was like a document, because at the time I thought maybe I was going to be a documentary filmmaker, and I was sort of filming a local struggle around schools, like the arrival of a charter school in South Williamsburg, and issues of sort of gentrification and racial justice in terms of schools. And then one guy I interviewed, he was like a community organizer, and I read in his bio that he was a former Young Lord, and I remembered reading a footnote in the history of the Black Panther Party that I read in France. So I asked about that, and he sort of lit up. And so initially I did a few articles for leftist magazines in France, but then I think what got me so interested was that I'm really curious about how sort of political collectives work. What are the dynamics, and what sort of the day-to-day life, like political organization? Because I always wonder when I read accounts, like, where does the money come from? Do people work? How do they deal with their affects? Like what moves them to become political? And the thing with the Young Lords was that because it wasn't as mythologized as the Black Panthers, and also the history is less contentious, and it's also less violent, because they weren't shot, or at least in New York, because I really focused on the group in New York. And also they were available, like founders who talked to me for a while. And so I think I decided to write a book after I interviewed one of the main members. Her name was Denise Oliver. And she was just awesome. And we talked for 7 hours, and she was really ready to go into she was very generous. And also I didn't know before that how feminist the group was, like to which extent. So I think it was that combination of, they were really willing to discuss lots of things. They weren't caught in their own myth, not too much, at least not the ones I met. And also there was this feminist aspect, and they were also pro-gay. They had like a gay caucus for members within the group, which is completely, I think, pretty, like, definitely rare at the time, maybe even unique in the sort of nationalist movements. So that combination was really interesting. And then afterwards, the book is I combined the interviews that I had done. Some of them were really long and sort of archival material, and then it became like, it took the form of an oral history. Because at first when I started writing, there was this issue of the voice. How do I tell that story? And so in the end, it's more like pas un collage, mais un sort of a montage of lots of the interviews that we had. And also because they focused a lot of their action in New York was on health, like health inequality and health issues. So there was a lot of direct actions. How do you call that? Dépistage. Like the testing for lead poisoning or things like that. And also, so I felt also that even if the context was very, very far away from like a French context, because the issues of Puerto Rican independence, I mean, it's not very far, because there's definitely, there would be parallel with some colonies et territoires d'outre-mer. But mostly I felt that because they were so willing to talk about that action, and also they wrote about it at the time, it would be useful for lots of sort of activists involved in creating community organizing, because we don't have in France something as sort of clear a paradigm as community organizing. There is definitely like a network of association and groundwork that's being done in terms of food pantries or health-related issues, but nothing is sort of that has a strong tradition as community organizing does. So yeah, I think it was sort of a mix of all of that. And it's nice because it's really got, I think in some like leftist circles, it served a little bit of, I know it's been studied in some circles, and I think it's mostly because of the health activism, because we don't I mean, right now, after the pandemic and the confinement, issues of health inequalities are so obvious that there's more discussions around it, but we don't have as much like that tradition of self-organizing by minorities is not as strong, I think, in France. Also because I think it's being less studied as opposed to America, but still the paradigm is not as strong. The models is not as strong. So I think also that's why, I mean, I was interested, and then it resonated in some parts. But I know
Yeah.
that there were some in Philly as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I am vaguely aware that they were like fairly like at least northeast spread out, if not maybe the whole nation, I think.
Yeah, mostly Northeast.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, I think, because I feel, obviously there's a lot of protests and a lot of action in Philly right now. And Cedric was just telling me that there is also similarly like a lot of action on the streets of France right now. And one of the things that feels, I don't know, it feels like health actually is a part of this, that to some degree, like part of the energy to be out in the streets is kind of being in the middle of a pandemic that we know in the US is killing Black people far more than it's killing other people. I mean, I think I read that the death rate was 3 times as high for Black Americans as it was, or for Black people living in America, as it is for other people. And so and of course, this is set off by a police killing in which someone can't breathe, and so there's a degree to which, in which someone is choked until they cannot breathe. And so there's a degree to which it feels as if actually that like health direct action relationship that feels really strong right now, though I'm not sure I've seen much writing about it, but there's a part of me that is thinking about the protests at the moment when I'm not in them, and it's sort of like, I mean, some of this energy is partially, at least in the US, I think, about a state that on the one hand is abandoning people to take care of themselves, in the middle of a pandemic that clearly is a community problem, a nationwide problem, etc. And then on the other hand, of course, if the state is not negligent in letting people die, then it is killing them, as in the case of George Floyd. And yeah.
No, absolutely. Actually, that made me think. My neighbor, next door neighbor, is American, and she was telling us, she was here last night and telling us how she's really desperate or like very sad because of the political situation and being so far away. And we were discussing, and I was asking her, because reading the news from here, sometimes I get the impression, maybe that's sort of the optimist point of view, that the Trump presidency, as violent and violent everything it is, it's also maybe, I mean, I wonder if it's how to say, catalyzed movements of resistance. I mean, even before that, Black Lives Matter, I think, was pre-Trump, right?
Yeah, it was under Obama in 2014,
Yeah.
but still, yeah.
So, and also like that sort of lots of young people becoming very mobilized around the Bernie Sanders candidacy and all of that. So I wonder if it's just a sort of prism bias from here, or if there is that component as well, that because things are so clearly bad, and like the maybe the les camps, tu vois, like the, how do you call that? Like not really the teams, but the forces in prisons are so strong. Like the antagonism is so strong that maybe it galvanizes resistances. What do you think? Is that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think what I think depends on how tired I am or how sad I am. Some days I wake up on Friday's protests, which was sort of the beginning of everything in Philly, for a lot of it, I was amped. I was like happy to see people in the streets and to see people really laying their bodies on the line for something that they cared about. Though, of course, one wishes that one never had to take any damage, of course, to get basic things like life. But there was a part of me that, hearing the chants, seeing the number of people was optimistic, is optimistic, and seeing people try to take down the statue of the racist mayor who had ordered the bombing of a Black Philadelphia community at one point in the 70s or in the 80s. I was really hopeful, and then I went home the next day and I also sort of work part-time with the Philadelphia Community Bail Fund. So we try to, basically raise money for people who can't afford to post bail. and help to post bail for people who can't afford to post bail. And, you know, we got a bunch of bail requests, and just seeing the sort of bureaucracy sort of holding people, then I was really sad, and I was like, oh no, we're losing, you know. And then the National Guard comes in, and, you know, you see pictures of like armored vehicles, and it's like, oh no, we're definitely losing. And then, you know, then you see people still going out and fighting, and it's really hard to tell, you know. I mean, it's really hard to tell. I don't really know. Sometimes I think, though, that there is a particularly strong current of organizing in especially conservative and counter-revolutionary times in the US. Like, there's a degree to which the US is kind of, I don't know, sometimes negligence of its communities, because things are so hands-off and there's not a welfare state and etc., has enabled, if not forced, many communities that are persecuted to sort of learn to organize against, you know, a state, or in the midst of a state that doesn't care about them. And so there is a degree to which I think, you know, I was just reading in Minneapolis about a hotel in which people who didn't have anywhere to go had just taken it over, and now that's where people were living, you know. And there is a degree to which I think you can sort of see throughout sort of US history, in the middle of like pretty vastly counter-revolutionary times, some very strong organizing that is resistant. I mean, I'm curious, I suppose, yeah, what is the situation in France like right now? I only briefly am aware that there are protests on in relation to a police killing as well. And
Yeah, I think so it's a little weird. I mean, I was just saying that because I'm on maternity leave, and so it's this time where I don't know, I'm less informed that I would be otherwise. Also because of confinement, I just went black on the sort of social network because it was too much.
yeah.
But from what I saw and read, so yesterday there were tens of thousands of people who gathered to so it's all in support of the American demonstrations, but also to highlight, to focus attention on the fact that police violence and police brutality is happening in France, and mostly around a very like iconic, with lots of commas, but the case of a young man who was killed by the police years ago, Adama Traoré, in the so-called suburbs of Paris, and whose murderer, like he was killed by a, you know, with like in the context of a police operation, and the police has always denied that they had basically étouffé, just like they pressed on him so that
Mhm.
same thing, like he couldn't breathe, and then he died. And his sister has been fighting for years to get justice for him. So the name of the movement is not really the name, but like the sort of rallying sentence is Justice pour Adama, justice for Adama. And she's been organizing for years and using, like, sort of forecasting the story of her brother to highlight the sort of systemic racism and violence that's taking place in France. And yesterday, I mean, like, the images were very strong, and I really regretted not being there. And I was wondering whether I would go this weekend, because it's not that common, I think. Because usually these marches, I mean, they're common in the areas where it happens, mostly where the police brutality focuses, because this is where you have lots of basically non-white French and immigrants living in the poor areas. But I think what we're witnessing is maybe a larger segment of the middle class and the white middle class and the young white middle class sort of joining, taking, you know, part of that movement. I think because of the influence of the sort of intersectionality paradigm and things like that. So protests are happening more and more. That's all I know for this one. I think is very recent, but there's been, what's really interesting with that Justice pour Adama movement. I mean, there's lots of organizations who organize against violence, police violence, and structural systemic racism. The thing in France, as you probably know, is that we don't. There's no, like, the thinking on race is not much developed. To talk even about whiteness is something that seems still very sort of radical and or like militant jargon or academia related. We're light years behind with these issues. We don't have racial statistics. So it's very, like, everything is structured on the notion of colorblindness. So we're very slow. And that's very clear each time something happens in the US, like racial tensions. And then, so the media in France covers it a lot. It's usually like the main title on the news. And they will say a black young man was killed by a white police cop. Never, like, the same situation happens in France.
Yeah.
And
It's
the
like,
guy
that
is
happens
not
in
white,
America.
is not
Yeah.
Arab, and the policeman is not white when you read the headlines. So I think people are also more and more, I mean, on social media, which is very filtered and tiny, but on my feed, pointing that more and more. Like one good montage was showing how in one newspaper called Le Parisien, which for Paris would be, I don't know, something like maybe the New York Post, or like a local newspaper, but sort of prominent. And what they call the riots in New York is features in the political section, and then the demo, the protest for justice pour Adama, is on faits divers, which what would it be, like local news or like local stories, tu vois? So I think it's moving. I really think it's moving. I think the discourse on race, and definitely very much influenced by American concepts and American movements, is starting to influence more and more, like seep down. I think my view of it is very biased because I live in Paris. I'm middle class. I'm involved in some anti-racist projects as well. So like my feed is very, but still, I think these issues, like the terms of blanchité, which is our equivalent for whiteness, was not used even like 5 or 6 years ago. I mean, I think it was still in university. You start having the first conferences on that. But the notion that there is systemic racism at play, and that the police, and that we saw that during the confinement as well, because it was very strict. They established what they called an état d'urgence sanitaire, so state of emergency for health reasons. And you had, for the first, I think for the whole length of the confinement, you were allowed to leave your house only for an hour, and you had to have like a sort of written certification that you were out there only for a set of very specific.
This was your hour.
Yeah, and you had only like 5 reasons to go out, like get groceries, go to the doctor, walk for an hour, no more, something like that. And then a lot of police controls again happened in areas where most of the population is not white. And lots of arrests also were made in Le 93, for example, which is one of the poorest departments in Paris. So all of that was very out there. But the resistance to the notion of systemic racism in France is really staggering, I think. I mean, I know in the US has very strong also white supremacism and denial of race issues, but I always feel that at least, I mean, it's on the table. It's words that you use that are, France is light years ahead. No, not ahead, but like behind on these issues.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but I think the organizing is just starting, because I think there will be more protests this weekend. I don't think I'll go because they're usually the cops are really violent now for a few years, and so they tear gas and all of that. So I think with the pregnancy, probably I won't go. But I think I don't see reasons for it to stop. Also because when the confinement happened, we had like the whole season of protest in the winter, protesting against a reform on retirement pensions and all of that. And there were very interesting initiatives to create junctions between this movement like Justice pour Adama. So basically the disenfranchised youth from immigrant background, like the non-white kids, who are victims of that sort of police brutality and racism and poverty and all of these. And for these movements to sort of meet another area of protest that was called les Gilets jaunes, and they were more sort of what would have been called before the working class, becoming poorer and poorer, and with the welfare state sort of crumbling. And they did a lot of protests, like blocking the roads, tons of protests in Paris also in the winter. And there were very interesting junctions starting to happen. It's definitely not a natural conjunction. It's really political worlds with very different traditions, and racism also being an issue would make it not that easy to create that junction. But it was happening. So I don't see why not people are so pissed now. And also because, I mean, I don't know how that sort of exit of the confinement is happening in the US, but right now there's something so indecent about how the population at large is just being told to get out and buy stuff. I'm simplifying, but really there's that notion of, okay, people, we have an economic crisis coming in, let's change nothing in terms of structure, but buy stuff.
Yeah.
So I think the level of anger is high. I mean, it was high before the confinement. Then you had like a sort of moment of union sacrée, maybe a little bit like sacred sort of union, which is a term used referring to First World War in France, where all the parties were like, okay, let's shut up, this is war, this is wartime, this is emergency. But it's becoming so clear that nothing, like there no structural reform is going to be done. Maybe for hospital, I think they're going to refinance the health sector because they can't just, because again, for economical reason, I don't think they can afford another pandemic like this that would stop the economy. So probably the hospital and healthcare worker are going to get some stuff, but that's it. Like there's no ecological reform taking place whatsoever. So I don't know. I think it's very likely that it goes on. I do hope so. That would be that would really be good. Oh, and also because the Justice for Adama, I just saw that I think a police report just was released because the family has been fighting to get new autopsies for years, and I think it shows, like it says officially for the first time that Adama was killed because of pressure on his torso. So maybe that will lead to the condemnation of the cops, which would be a huge victory for that movement. And I don't know, like his sister, the woman who's leading that, is very very articulate, very charismatic, and I think a lot of people are also hoping that she would rise even more, maybe as political leader, because there's definitely a lack of women of color in taking sort of in national politics. So I think it's something around that's happening. It was a very long answer. Sorry to your.
No, I was happy to hear it. That was, yeah. No, I mean, it's funny, the sort of get out and buy things, because, yeah, I mean, in the US, that's certainly been the attitude, it's sort of like, yeah, it's like, we don't care if you were exposed to violence, and also what's more, we'll give you very little money. Also by violence, I mean, of course, the disease, like and we won't give you very much money. We'll give you $1,200 in a stimulus check, which is basically nothing, once in June. So what we want is for you to go buy things, and also for you to go back to work, and that will jumpstart the economy. And also, as though there weren't already economic problems to begin with, right? That
right.
I mean, there were very clearly bubbles in the U.S. economy that have burst to some degree because of the pandemic. But the sort of bizarre assumption that everything will just be fine now if we just go back to buying things is truly bizarre. I do see that we have a prompt, which is recorded violence, which, yeah, I mean, I think.
Yes, I was actually, that's something I wanted to ask. That was one of the questions I had when you discussed briefly. You mentioned your dissertation. So representations of violence, but in which
Yeah, I suppose that's quite vague. Yeah.
I know you gave me the short bit, but now I want the slightly longer pitch.
Yeah. So, I mean, my dissertation is really just about representations of police violence in the African American novel. And it's
Okay.
really like, roughly like 1945 to like 1990 thereabout. Part of the reason I think is because, in the United States, a lot of our understanding of representations of police violence is that we understand it as sort of like from Rodney King in 1992 on, in which, a man has a camcorder that he's purchased and he records the Rodney King beating. And then, of course, Rodney King survives and the police go free as well, even though it's all on tape and the tape is sort of broadcast across the nation. And so I'm a little bit interested, I think, in sort of what happens in writing, how exactly are people capturing these things? And in particular, how are people capturing these things in literature? Because if you look in the African-American novel, it's kind of everywhere in a way, in ways that you wouldn't surprise. I mean, if you really dig into the history, you can find it in newspapers, etc. But somewhat surprisingly, in the African-American novel, there are all these books that I had read where it's like, oh, there's police violence in that book. In this other book, it's like Ralph Ellisson, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, Richard Wright, it sort of like really spans a long period of time. And so Alice Walker, Tony Kidd Bombara, etc. And so that's part of that, what that dissertation is about. I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about recently is, of course, the George Floyd killing. We have some footage, some images. One of the things that I think I've been thinking a lot about in the US is, it's been probably at least 50 years since like Bloody Sunday in Selma, in which some demonstrators were demonstrating in Selma and the police sort of attacked them. And this was captured by journalists and broadcast on news, which is to say it's been a long time that it's been on video in the United States. And since at least Rodney King in 1992, it's been actually pretty long that it's been on video, not just by journalists, but by, people. One brief thing that I have heard people talk about again in the United States after the George Floyd killing has been a desire for police body cameras. That always strikes me as a bizarre one because we have the footage of the Rodney King beating and the police walked. We have the footage of the George Floyd killing and he's still dead, I mean, there's a degree to which I think the video era of violence, of police violence, is a little bit longer than we think. And I'm a little bit curious about that in some ways. Like, what does it mean that we've sort of been in this era for maybe 45 years?
Yeah.
If I'm doing my math correctly. Since Bloody Sunday in 65, but still people are calling for video as though it might help something. And then on the other hand, the videos do seem to help, but I don't know, I feel quite mixed about it. But there is a degree to which I think also sometimes there's a narrative question as well, of course, right? Like in the Rodney King trial, the police officers who beat Rodney King tell this story in which Rodney King was dangerous, and therefore their use of force is justified. And that the way that they can kind of control the narrative in the courtroom that is still verbal, even though you have the video footage, kind of determine some things. Now, of course, like I don't actually believe in prisons or jails, so like whatever, like I'm not particularly invested in, cops being prosecuted and found guilty because I don't think that this is a legitimate way of dealing with harm anyway. Yet the inequality in treatment in the system that many people are sort of locked up for nothing. Meanwhile, we have videos of police officers killing people and they get to walk. That is troubling to me. But I don't know. I mean, I guess I don't actually know much about recordings of police violence in France at all, or recordings of violence in general that you might have thoughts about.
There are some I'm thinking about because recently, so like last year, the protest I was telling you about in the winter, Les Gilets Jaunes, so the name of the yellow vests, they were organizing protests every weekend, and some of them were pretty violent. But so the police was like the comment on dit putain the police reaction was very very violent as well. So lots of things were filmed, and I'm thinking it's always this issue. So there are some, definitely, they've been around for a while. I don't think there's body cameras, although maybe. But I think from the cases I remember, it's useful basically because with like when activists slash journalists analyze the footage, I think it's a good way to show. I'm thinking about one case in particular where a protester lost an eye in Paris because one of the policers shot like straight instead of doing this sort of like bell shaped, which they're supposed to do. And some footage, but it wasn't necessarily, I think it was just someone filming randomly to post on Twitter or something. And then that combined with really great work from some journalists and combining various footage taken by various people of the square, that was able to demonstrate that it was indeed one policeman who shot straight ahead in complete violation of what he's allowed to do, that had qui avait provoqué, that had produced the guy losing an eye. But I think I would say, but I'm not entirely sure, but I would tend to say I think it really also depends on who films, because it's always the issues, like whatever document, of course, is always in the context, and who produces the document. And as you were saying, like the courtroom, the weight of the words is very, very different. So I think in the suburbs, les quartiers populaires, where most of that police brutality happens, there are always footages, very, very often. But they definitely are not enough to get any of the cops convicted. Because again, because of the narrative, like because of the low status and in terms of credibility of the people who produce the images, when it's not vetted by a journalist or a prominent lawyer or something. And yeah, I would say because of the sort of staticity of the judicial systems in that. I think that's what I would say. I don't remember very. I think they're mostly useful, these images in France, for rallying people. I think it's probably the same in the US, but just to get journalist attention, rallying people, but they definitely don't get the perpetrators convicted of anything, you know, like even just losing their job, not necessarily jail, but the sanction is definitely not directly tied to that.
Yeah, no, that sounds about right. I suppose in the US it's very much about rallying, you know. I just often feel mixed because I mean, there's a part of me that is sort of like, I would just rather people didn't die, you know, and videos don't really change those things. Our next prompt is bodies.
And also, we're thinking about the body cup. It's something I was wondering about when I remember writing about that for an article some years ago. And a part of me also, because I write a little bit about tech and I'm concerned about surveillance issues and panopticon society, and also a part of me, but I'm very conflicted. Part of me thinks it's a bad path and a bad slope to equip whichever body of work with cameras that constantly record what they do. But then another part of me is like, yeah, of course, but you're white and middle class, so you're not likely to get jumped by a cop anytime. So I'm very conflicted. But a part of me is also thinks it's not something I would want to see happening, just because of the precedent it sets in terms of recording of public space. Also because of this cameras can record other things. Same thing with like the drones recording the protest and things like that. Of course, that's a way to identify police violence when it takes place, but it's also a way to identify all of the people who were there, who were demonstrating. And I don't think that should be public information, I mean, for all to see. So I'm very conflicted about. Also, I think I read at the time, but that was some years ago, but that the studies about this body camera were not very conclusive, because sometimes it doesn't work, because also who watches the footage. But I'm not entirely sure about that. It's mostly the issue of the surveillance that I'm.
No, I mean, I'm on board with that. I mean, I think in the US, in a lot of ways, I mean, in general, there's a part of me that is like, don't give any more money to the police, less money. You know, it's like they don't need to be bigger, they don't need more technology, they are bad, you know. So, like, spending money on body cameras, it's like, what if we just had fewer police officers, you know?
Yeah,
Instead
and better trained.
right, you know. And I think, especially in the US, you know, I mean, there's a degree to which one of the things that's scary, I think, about being constantly surveilled in that way, right? I mean, particularly if you live in the hood in the US, sometimes there are never cops when you need them. And yet at the same time, and you can see this in Philly, right? They're just, they're just sort of on certain blocks where that are quote unquote violent or like whatever, you know, where dangerous things happen according to the police, you know, and I worry about many of my friends who have been incarcerated, who have served time, you know, what it would mean for them to show up on a police body camera while they are on parole or while they are out on bail,
Yeah.
sort of be constantly surveilled in that way. I mean, because for so many of us, indeed, some of the things that we do kind of need to not be seen
Mhm.
to be able to do them, be it whatever, you know, sometimes it is seeing someone you're close to. Um, if you are, you know, according to certain, like for instance, like let's say there's a gang ordinance in your city and you're not supposed to be in a certain neighborhood, and yet also you have family in that neighborhood, you know, or, you know, if for whatever reason, you know, you are just selling drugs, you know, and that's just like what you do, and no judgment on my part, you know, but that's like what you're doing to make your income, what it would mean to then be surveilled while you're also out on bail, or while you're on parole in that way is really, really horrifying. I mean, yeah, the surveillance part of this, and especially from the state, you know, it's like I don't want the state to have more footage of me. I want the state to know less about me in a way, unless it's like, you know, providing me welfare, you know, like giving me healthcare, giving me a sort of like supportive economy, etc. But when the state is so violent towards so many of us, it's hard to want them to have more, you know, knowledge about me, you know.
Yeah, definitely. And I think once the images are there, there is no way, it never happens that they're only used for the purpose that they're recorded for. I mean, if it can, if the regulatory bodies are in place, um, but in practice, it never happens. I mean, once they're there and they're available for surveillance, then so yeah, but again because I'm definitely not targeted by police brutality. I always wonder about. Mm,
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, it's complicated, right? Because I think also, like you pointed out, the rallying part is meaningful, but on the other hand, you know, yeah, I mean, we have the footage of some violence, and sometimes people will still walk free, and we have the footage in some other cases, and that doesn't bring a life back, you know.
yeah.
There are some other easier ways of getting rid of police brutality, which might be, you know, getting rid of the police, you know.
Ouais, c'est ça. Or making. I mean, I don't know how it is in the States, but in France, definitely there is a culture of, comment on dit, impunity
Hmm.
for police brutality. Definitely, and so, and I don't think that will be changed by the cameras, because as you were saying, we have these images
Right.
and they haven't been changing anything. So if I don't know how that, I don't know how that would, I don't know, maybe public pressure, if more people start to be discussing racism. I don't know how that will change, but it's definitely a system. It's like a structural move, not. I'm sorry, my English is.
No, no, I'm following. We have a prompt on desire. Maybe this will be a good
Yeah, that.
opportunity. I'm curious to hear about your book about pornography.
Yeah, well, it was called alors les chemins de désir, which is I don't know if you know that expression, desire lines.
Hmm.
You know, it's like it's a path that you see, like where people use, but it's not the official roads.
Mhm.
So basically, it's sort of, I would say, memoir, probably in English, tracing from. I mean, it's autofiction, but it's not so much. And it's very focused on. I wanted to trace the development of a sort of pornographic imaginary. Um, so that's it. So from it starts. The first episode is when the narrator is about eight, and she discovers that her grandmother, this sort of like iconic, matricial scene where she's like upstairs, and because all of the grown-ups are doing something else, and she's looking in the bookshelf, and she finds this sort of erotica comics.
Mm.
And then one scene sort of strikes her, and it's two women together, and one of them is tied up. So it's like this sort of conjunction of desire, restraint, and emergence of like something that sort of cuts through her childhood world. And then basically the rest of the book is sort of an exploration of the impact of that initial image and erotic shock within her imagination, because the book never discusses very few like actual sexual practices, or and then because she was born in the 80s, then it's how this sort of first image gives birth to this ramification as les supports de pornographie, like the medium for pornography evolves with the internet coming in. And so first, like there's the websites, the erotica stories posted by amateurs in the early aughts, and then YouTube, like but YouPorn, and like this whole huge machines for generating desires and consumption through an obsession. And basically the questions up time, it's difficult to discuss it in English, but it sounds I sound smarter in French, but
It sounds smart in English. Like
no, because, and then as the narrator grows up, the issue of the tension between the fact that she's having this sort of lesbian pornographic imagination when her practices is mostly straight, and that what she gets off on is scenarios of female domination when she discovers feminism. And that's like about 15 years ago, so that's before not only Me Too, but only also the resurgence of feminism on social media and all of that. So I wanted to explore these issues of contradictions from a feminist point of view, and also how, in my experience, the consumption of porn was never something that was that alienating. How also because of the architecture of these websites, like the tags, for example, there's a whole thing about all these tags that open up new alleys for curiosity and desire, even though they're also very much entwined with capitalist logic, mostly for the tubes, like these huge websites, but how they can also open up new avenues for your desires, and how that narrator, by following up these tags, discover sort of a never-ending really unfolding of that initial scene, because the variations are sort of endless, because each new tag opens up a new variation. So yeah, and that sort of ties back to sort of the things I'm interested in with writing of digital, like how our tools impact our affect and how we feel and how we position ourselves in the world. Because at times I do feel this mostly on porn. I think some part of the conversation is missing, and that's that sort of very granular examination of what it does to you. Because I feel there are some discourses, of course, I agree with, like the notion of female exploitation is definitely real and central in the porn industry. Definitely exposure of young kids to porn has an impact on how you form your ideas about sexuality and about power and sexuality. But it's not only that. It can also be used for so many things. And one thing also that I was interested in was, it's not queer porn, because I think that's something that is sometimes, to me, seems like an easy theoretical response. You have like the mainstream is bad because it reproduces like classical schemes of domination and female subjection, blah 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 blah, blah, and hetero normativity, la la la. All of that is true, And always you have this sort of like magic move, but there's the queer, let's queer things. And of course, on one level, I agree, and I do think that. But in terms of the porn, of course, that would be like for me the best answer. Oh yeah, I was sort of addicted to mainstream porn, but then I discovered feminist porn and queer porn, and that's awesome because now I'm free. But that's not what happened.
Right.
And I think, and I suspect in a lot of cases, we still get off on things that are very mainstream and that point out that, you know, like touch our contradictions. Because I remember reading like the work of a sociologist who's done one of the very few, at least in France, studies of how he was gay men. He studied a gay men cohort, how they use porn. And it was very interesting because he showed that there were a variety of contexts in which they consume porn. And he was telling me that he'd been discussing with like sex activists or queer activists, you know, like running queer porn festivals and that, so people who were very used to have like a very critical eye on porn and watching queer porn and watching it in group and discussing it, but that most of them, at least the people he interviewed, when they wanted like a quick, you know, release, they would still watch mainstream porn. So yeah, I think a part of it was to dispel that like sort of too easy feminist answer sometimes, like let's just queer things and it will be great. No, because we're formed, like our affects have grown in a mainstream society, so it's not like we can magically try to re-queer the whole structure of what we want and what we desire. And I'm very interested in this sort of coexistences of the things that we inherit that are very oppressive, but they formed our desires and things that we gravitate towards, and how what do you do with that once they're there?
Yeah, I mean, I've so many thoughts. I mean, really briefly, I was thinking about this Joan Morgan, who was this journalist who then wrote this book, When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost, and she calls herself, you know, a hip hop feminist. And I can't remember if it's in the book or if it's in one of her articles, but there's a sort of brief moment where she writes about how, you know,
Did you
there's the
say John Morgan?
Joan Morgan. Yeah. Oh, I really hope I'm getting that name right.
I'll look it up.
Yeah, I will send you an email regardless
Yeah.
after. But you know, there's this moment, you know, because it's this moment in which there's all this critique of hip hop as particularly sexist, and Joan Morgan is like, yes, that's all true, and the, you know, the thug who's this like sexist man, and she's like, but sometimes I'm at the club and I hear the thug, you know, talk to me in a certain way, and I still feel that desire, you know, and I get that. I mean, I mean, whatever, my relationship to my gender is all messy and complicated, probably like everybody else's. But I think for a long time, I remember as a young person feeling so not desired and really, really identifying with, in mainstream movies, not porn specifically, but I'm thinking actually about like the kind of like sappy romance TV shows or sitcoms or even fucking like James Bond movies, you know. The person who I both identified with and wanted to be was always the sort of like the woman who is desired, you know what I mean? And I still feel that, I mean, quite strongly in a way when I watch some of these TV shows today, which I will claim are like good, you know, or like romantic comedies, which I will like come up with all sorts of bullshit intellectual reasons for why they are
Yeah.
actually movies or whatever. But the truth is that I just want to see the girl get the guy at the end, you know, and there are all these ways in which, I mean, truly we have all these moments in life. I mean, because of course, sure, there are all these things that are fucked up about the porn industry, and yes, in the U.S., like porn industry should be sex workers should be unionized, etc. And also, it's not as though those our desires aren't being constructed in non-porn scenarios. You know what I mean? And
Absolutely.
right, you know, and certainly this is true for me. I mean, every TV show that I had seen as a young person had a romantic plot, you know, even something as banal as like Friends, in which like, you know, life is supposed to never change. They're in this kind of stable middle class economic sphere. And sure, they'll have a problem in one episode, but that problem will never appear again the next episode. Like life resets. And yet, of course, it still has to end with like Ross and Rachel getting together. You know, they're like, the romantic plot is always the kind of culmination. And And so all of which is to say, you know, our desires are so intensely shaped already in all kinds of fucked up ways
Yeah.
by non-porn, you know. And I mean, just as another incident, I mean, I remember being quite young. You know, I was born in Jamaica. I lived in Jamaica till I was 7. Then we moved to the US. We lived in Brooklyn for a little bit. Then we moved out of the city. And I was in this sort of like majority white school. And I remember in 7th grade or so being with this group of
Seventh grade is how old? Seventh grade?
That's a good question.
Because I
12?
never know.
12?
Okay.
15?
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure off the top of my head. Um,
But
I would say I was somewhere between like 10 and 13, you
okay.
know, and being with this group of boys who, for whatever reason, the conversation topic had come up that was, you know, who is the hottest girl in our grade? Um, and I remember having had thought that it was one person, and I remember this distinctly. And then everyone in the sort of conversation said this other girl who was a white woman, you know, and that was like not the thing for me at the time. I mean, whatever. To what degree does like a, you know, a 6th grader, 7th grader have complicated romantic racial desires? But, you know, I had come from a majority Black country and my family was Black, and I had not, you know, had that impression that this young white girl was the hottest girl in our grade or whatever. After that conversation, suddenly she looked a lot prettier to me, you know, and I thought that she was very hot, you know, and it was this really bizarre thing in which it's like, I mean, yes, of course, all these ways in which the porn industry does stuff can be quite exploitative, but also like the sort of general culture of sexism with regards to desire that permeates, at least, you know, that permeates culture, to say nothing of the kind of like transphobic relationships to gender that also permeate desire, really, really makes it kind of hard to escape that desire when you go on to grow up. You know what I mean? Like, it's, even if you were to never watch porn, there's actually still all kinds of fucked up ways in which your desire is constructed in all these troubling ways. I mean, of course, how you respond to that is your business, but desire is not that simple, you know?
no, absolutely. And that was something that was very interesting after the reactions I got to the book, because there's this sort of central contradiction between the fact that the narrator is mostly straight, she's having sex mostly with males, but all her imagination is entirely lesbian. And so people started telling me more about like their sort of contradictions, and at some point I had the idea that I would start sort of collect them, but not enough. But I remember one guy, a journalist, who was telling me he'd always been gay, always had crushes on boys, and like never, but for some reason always watches straight porn, even though that's not even something that he experimented with when he was in his teens. And I think there's also this, like, as much as our desires are very much normalized by what we're exposed to and what we're being told is desirable, there's also this sort of weird zone, and where probably psychoanalytic tendencies come into play and other things, a relation to power, to losing yourself, to strength.
Our parents.
Yeah, and where it stops fitting the narrative you have about yourself. And I think that was what I was also really interested in, because when I discovered feminism, like that was 10 years ago, or like no more, 15 years ago, let's say, that was before all of the mainstreaming of it. Um, and it created a forest of contradiction in my head, because I was constantly thinking, but how can I be thinking that if I'm a feminist? Like, am I allowed to want to wear makeup because I love makeup? But then if I'm a feminist, like, how can I do that? And it seemed to me that there's something in our desires and in the porn, because we can't act on all of our desires. But if you follow, like, for example, the tag logics, because like the 5th chapter, for example, is on this subgenre called hentai, which is sort of Japanese anime, like comics which are erotic, but then monsters come in and tentacles come in and like all of these things. And to me, I mean, of course, it's like the process of rewriting it is made, it fits a narrative with an arc and all of that, but still there is this part where it was very surprising to discover that about myself. Like, why am I turned on by that? What does that mean? But also something very exciting, not in the sexual sense of the term of, wow, there are parts of me that are really surprising to myself that don't fit a narrative that I could have about myself. Whether that's normalizing or feminist, there's just this very strange thing that I discovered, and my desire, the thing that turned me on, they point at zones in me that I could not have suspected before. And there was this, and that's also one theme of the book, and something that I think I care about, is this issue of, because neoliberalism is putting our affects at work so much, and because we're taught to shape our affects, what we want, what we desire. We were discussing about the buying stuff earlier. That's all the same thing. And in terms of racism, that's so clear. Also, whiteness is
And
like
also
white superiority. Yeah, is about which
yeah.
bodies are desirable, which bodies are visible, and all of that. It's so much contentious, like a site for the power where it lands in us, that anything that can take you out or like show you parts of you that are not colonized or not colonized yet is really interesting. And I think porn, if you start like following all these like crazy tags, you can do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking also, I mean, because I remember, of course, like being a high schooler and just being sort of in this very hypermasculine, anti-queer environment, and sort of insistently imagining that I was only straight, and then leaving for college just on the tip of, things that can open up or help us
Mhm.
discover desires. I remember leaving for college and suddenly being in a place where it was more acceptable to be queer, and then thinking back on friendships that I'd had that were really meaningful to me. And I was like, why was I like so invested in this boy? Why did I get jealous if he was hanging out with other people? Or me? And I was like, oh fuck, I just had a crush on this boy, but I was also unable to discover this desire as romantic because of my atmosphere at the time. And so there's a way in which sometimes going down different desires in the present, right? Like, I mean, of course, after that point, in college, my sex life became very different, but there's a way in which just discovering those desires in the present can really kind of transform our understanding of the past as well, and our desires in the past and our desires for the past. I do see a note that we do need to end by 11 or 15, so we should do some recommendations.
Okay. Well, I won't recommend any porn.
Yeah, fair enough. Oh no, Claire, I think we lost you. Claire? Oh no. Am I frozen or is Claire frozen? Claire, I hear you.
Oh,
Are you back?
yes. Can you hear me? I can hear you.
Okay, great. Oh, you're back.
Okay.
Perfect.
My
Beautiful.
connection was yeah, actually I was thinking just that when you were because that's the recommendation, but maybe you've read it because it's an English book I just finished. It's called In the Dream House.
Oh yeah, that book's very good.
I loved it, and I just thought about it when you said like that sort of lack of an idea of a concept for something, and then when you discover, oh yeah, I had it, so that was what it was. It was a crush, and because she discusses that, like the sort of taboo on abusive relationship within lesbian communities, how that also sort of the lack of the archive for that or the words for that. But yeah, I think I have like a few pages left. I started it yesterday. I downloaded it during the confinement because I downloaded a lot of pirate books,
Yeah.
and it was not like going to the library or like the yeah. And it was so, I was very impressed.
Yeah,
Did
that
you?
book is really good. That book is really good. She's really fucking talented, huh? Like,
Oh,
yeah.
wow. I love that feeling when you read, you read it and it's like it moves you, and at the same time you're like so impressed.
Yeah.
The best
Sometimes
sense
I
of
feel
the term.
jealous too. I'm like, damn it, other people are out here writing like this. What the fuck am I supposed to write?
I know. And then I was thinking about it in the shower like earlier, and I was like, okay, so what if I use something like that for the the next sort of book I want to write. And then I was like, of course not, you can't, because that's just like, just basic theft.
Yeah.
So smart. That's so smart, because I think once it's an American woman who recommended it to me a few months ago, and I think I was a bit like, oh, okay, yeah, like because she described it as this, like everything is told through a different genre.
Mhm.
Like, okay, I don't know, I wasn't too, but it's so
It's
good.
super good. Yeah. Can I ask if you have any? I can read in French. I can kind of talk in French, but do you have any French recommendations?
Alors, actually, I thought about that. So there's one I read during the confinement that is awesome. That's really good, but it might be a bit difficult because she has this wonderful command of language, but it's called Arcadie.
Hmm.
I can send you the ebook. It's completely pirated, but
We'll edit this out that we're sending pirated books.
c'est ça, exactly. No, I encourage you to buy it from an independent bookseller to support them. By Emmanuel Bayamack-Tam, and it's the story of so the narrator is this sort of young girl. I don't remember what her name is, and she lands with her parents. They're like sort of misfits, but in a sort of funny way, in this commune that's called Arcadie. And she grows up there, and it's an exploration. Like she's sort of intersex, so her gender moves throughout her teenagehood as the community, the sort of ideal world is sort of shattered by the arrival of there's a migrant underground of the castle, and that sort of shows lines of division within the community. The pitch is not very interesting. I mean, when I heard the pitch, I thought it was too zeitgeisty. For me, there's something like it's queer and it's about communities, and it's also about how, the utopia of the left cannot make space for the migrants. So it had a feeling that it's ticking all the boxes, and it's a bit too like politically correct and a bit boring. But it's so not. It's amazing. Like the writing is fantastic. It's very, very smart. It avoids all of the traps of that sort of leftist political correctness that like you're bored because like how you're like, yeah, okay, we think the same, great, okay, we agree. It's fantastic. The writing is wonderful. I'll send it to you. Yeah, very good. Really, really one of the best books I've read in French in a while.
Oh, that's so great. That sounds super interesting to me, so I'm excited. Yeah, that sounds great. I was thinking a lot during our conversation. I'd read this like James Baldwin novel that wasn't particularly well reviewed, that people don't talk about that much. Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone.
I read that one.
Yeah, it's quite good. I mean, it's a complicated book. It's this boy who grows up and his brother takes care of him. Then his brother gets beat up by the cops and arrested. Then his brother comes back from prison and he's on a work farm, and his overseer on the work farm in prison, tries to sexually assault him. So it's like really brutal. And then the brother comes back, and then they masturbate together, which is this kind of like, and then, eventually the brother grows up and his sexuality is very complicated. It's certainly, he certainly sleeps with both women and men, but it's also just intensely racialized in a particular way. Like, and the thoughts about the relationship between like sexuality, gender, and race, and also just like the police and police violence, I think sort of resonates with a lot of what we have been talking about. And frankly, like I feel mixed about the Baldwin novels. Some of them are good. Some of them are, I understand that people like them, but they're not for me. But I read this book and I'm like, this book is fucking awesome.
Hey, nice.
Yeah. So Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, I think is really good. And then the last.
Just one thing, when you say like some Baldwin novels, people say they're really good, but you're not really into them. Like which ones, for example?
Oh no, I can't believe I'm saying this publicly.
It's okay, we'll edit it out.
I feel like Go Tell It on the Mountain is okay. I like the young sections of Go Tell It on the Mountain. The long sermon.
Is it the one that's called Harlem Quartet? I don't know. I don't know. Let me check because.
That's a good question. I wonder.
I think that's how they translated it, but I'm not entirely sure.
I wonder.
With like Julia, Jimmy, Arthur, and Hall. Is it this one?
Oh yeah, I think that is it. I think that's. I can't remember the names of the characters anymore. That's so funny.
Like one character, Julia, she's like a child pastor.
Yes. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Okay.
Oh wait, I wonder if that's because there's also a pastor in there's also a pastor in just above my head. But it's basically like it starts out with a young boy in Harlem.
Yeah.
And then his father, like then we go back to his father's memories of being a preacher in the South and being in the church in the South. And then we go back to the present.
No, this one is just above my head.
Ah, gotcha. That's just above my head. That makes more. I didn't know that they translated that as Harlem Quartet. That's fascinating.
Because I remember it's the first Baldwin novel that I read, and I was just floored. I loved it. I don't know. I remember,
Yeah.
yeah, I just
That's
loved it.
actually the only Baldwin novel I haven't read yet. Mostly because I have it on my shelf and I'm like, this is really long. Like I don't know when I'm gonna make the time to read this. But it's if you like, I mean, it's sort of like that's like when that's the last Baldwin published novel. And I
Okay.
think my understanding of the Baldwin trajectory is that like Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone is like the beginning of his like later era and the later style. And I think if you like that, you will like this book because it's
Great.
just super fucking good. It's super good.
Awesome.
I also read The Sphinx by Garréta recently, which Cedric tells me is more popular in English than it is in French.
Who?
Uh, yeah, Garréta, she was a member of the Oulipo group in France, and now she lives in the U.S., I guess, and teaches at Duke. And she wrote this book, The Sphinx, which, or at least in English, is translated as The Sphinx. I don't actually know the French word for Sphinx, but it's basically a love story in which the gender of the lovers is never described.
Okay.
And it's also an interracial love story. And it's interesting, I think. I mean, formally, the conceit I just found really quite fascinating. And so it's kind of a pleasure to read a book in which the gender of the two lovers is,
Yeah.
you just don't know, you know? I quite liked that book. I think it's also weirdly very good at describing grieving.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very good at describing grieving, I think.
Oh, attends, which makes me think also, it's an older book in grieving that was called Pain is the Thing with Feathers.
I don't know that.
Attends, I think because I read it in French and the translation was very good. La douleur porte un costume de plume. That's the French
Hmm.
name. But attends, where is it?
You wrote it?
I think it's called Pain is the Thing with Feathers. But otherwise, I'll find back the because I think that was beautiful. Very like it's very short. It's basically. Attends, do I have it here? I don't know. I'll look it up. Um, yeah, like the story, just a father with two kids and the mother has died or something like that, and it's sort of account of grieving, but with a very nice sort of literal representation of pain, and it really was wonderful. That sort of the grieving description made me think of that. Did you read? Because I was looking for new books during the confinement, so I was reading well, like I don't know many literary magazines. Oh, actually, that's something also I could ask, but maybe I'll email you because I always end up reading like the book reviews from the New York Review of Books or the New York Times because they're the ones I know. Have you read Doxology?
No.
I don't know, it was a book like everyone was talking about it, and I don't know, I was not very convinced, but the reviews were raving, so I wondered what I had missed. But yeah, it
Yeah,
doesn't
no,
matter.
it's funny, sometimes because I live in Philly, I'm a little out of the loop on what everybody's reading or talking about, Yeah, so I don't think I actually know that book, but I will.
It's not that good. Just in case, like the reviews were so enthusiastic, and I felt like I probably missed the entire book because I was like, I don't know, it's just a novel,
Yeah,
so whatever. But yeah, that's because the Machado book was very smart because it's so hard. I feel like this genre of the memoir is so well trodden now that it's
yeah,
it's difficult to find a new way of presenting. And actually, that makes me think. Very at the very very beginning, you said you were writing a novel. So is
Mhm.
it like entirely fiction, or is it memoir, or is it?
It's a good question. It feels a little bit of both, I guess. It feels like, I mean, some of the things are autobiographical, but a lot of it also is just very fictionalized, I think, you know. For instance, there's this like gun showdown in the book that never happened in my life, you know, and I just feel like I need to say that every time I talk about this book so that my mom doesn't worry that I was, you know, somewhere getting held up on a dirt road that I had no business being on, you know. So it's a bit of a mix, I think. It's a bit of a mix, yeah.
Okay, okay. And how's the writing going?
Well, so it's with the publisher now. So I like just sent
Oh, okay, wow.
yeah, so I sent a draft of edits to my editor, and so I'm just trying not to think about,
Yeah,
about it at all because yeah, you know, while I liked drafting the book, after a certain point I'm like, I've read this fucking book so much, you know, it's like I want to read something else. I mean, I think mostly it's just that editing feels painful sometimes, you know, but you know, you're reopening up all these questions that you'd stopped thinking about even at the sentence level, you know. It's like I
yeah,
wrote this sentence, I decided on this sentence, and then an editor is like, maybe you should write a different sentence, and it's like, should I write a different sentence? And it's like, but I stopped asking that question a year ago, why am I asking this question again, you know? And
yeah, yeah.
yeah, so I don't know, it's complicated, I think, you know, editing's, it's complicated.
Congratulations, though. That's great that it's in the editor's hands now.
Yeah, I'm grateful, you know, I'm grateful for my editor, and I just try not to think about it when I don't have to draft. You know, I'm just sort of like, oh, other stuff to do.
Great. What's
Yeah.
the title? Or like the
Yeah. So it's all the water I have seen is running.
okay.
Yeah. It's partially about track also. So there's like a bit of a pun there on the like, you know, running water is like rivers as opposed to snow, ice, whatever, and also like running as in people running.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. Um, I
Awesome.
actually have to go to a work thing.
Okay, okay, okay.
But it was so great to talk to you, and we should stay in
Yeah,
touch. I want to
yeah,
hear more
absolutely.
of everything. And I will
Yeah,
send you book recommendations via email also.
that would be great. And me too. If I and I will send you. So okay, this to be edited out. I will send you the pirated version of Arcadia. Really, really good. And then I'll try to think of a few French things that I've read that are good. And then I'll send you the names.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. Yeah, this was wonderful. I had a good time talking.
Yeah, me too.
Bye.
Bye bye.